On the 12th of November, 1942, deep within the western desert of North Africa, a captured American vehicle sat silent and alone beside the smoldering wreckage of a British supply column, its crew having vanished when their position became a lost cause. Standard Wehrmacht procedure was clear: destroy it or leave it to the sands. But the reconnaissance unit's commanding officer, struck by a different thought, had another idea entirely. "Get our best mechanic," he commanded. "I want to know if we can use this thing." What the Afrika Korps mechanics were about to uncover in the next 30 minutes would fundamentally challenge every belief they held about German superiority. The revelation was not a sudden thunderbolt of insight, but a creeping, insidious understanding that grew with every bolt they turned, with every component they examined. A small placard on the dash identified it: Willis MB. The Americans, they would learn, simply called it a Jeep. The first true shock came the moment they lifted the hood. You see, the engine compartment was a masterpiece of pristine, logical design, engineered for rapid maintenance by anyone with even the most basic mechanical sense. There were color-coded wires, clearly labeled components, and accessible parts that could be reached without a single specialized tool. In his 2 long decades of servicing German military vehicles, the senior mechanic had never encountered such thoughtful, brilliant engineering intended for the brutal reality of field maintenance. Every single bolt was standard. Every component appeared to be a perfect twin to those on every other vehicle of its type, a testament to a philosophy of mass production and effortless replacement. The engine itself, the Go Devil, displaced 134 cubic inches and produced a mere 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. These were not numbers that would impress a German engineer, but the philosophy that breathed life into it was nothing short of revolutionary. This engine wasn't meticulously crafted to be perfect. It was masterfully designed to be simple, to be reliable, and above all, to be producible on an unimaginable scale. A mechanic with the barest minimum of training could service this engine using only the most basic tools. There were no specialty wrenches to be found, no complex procedures demanding the touch of a factory-trained technician. The Americans had apparently designed this vehicle with the absolute certainty that young farm boys and city factory workers would be the ones keeping it alive under the hell of combat conditions. By that November of 1942, the contrast between the American and German philosophies of military vehicle design had become a chasm, stark and undeniable. America would go on to produce over 640,000 of these Jeeps during the war. Germany, in contrast, would manage to build just over 50,000 of its Kübelwagens. And more troubling still was the truth this disparity represented. The Jeep embodied the very pinnacle of American manufacturing thought, standardized, simplified, and designed for mass production by semi-skilled workers using an endless supply of perfectly interchangeable parts. The officers approached as the mechanics continued their silent, focused inspection. "Well," one asked, "can we use it?" The senior mechanic looked up from his work, choosing his words with the deliberate care of a man delivering a verdict. "This vehicle is remarkable. It is designed by someone who truly understands the conditions of the field." One officer frowned, a reflexive defense of national pride. "German engineering is the finest in the world." The mechanic didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply gestured towards the four-wheel drive system. "Look at this transfer case. A single lever engages four-wheel drive. One lever. Our Kübelwagens require multiple operations, and most of them don't have four-wheel drive at all." The Wehrmacht's primary light vehicle, the Volkswagen Type 82 Kübelwagen, was an excellent machine in so many respects. Ferdinand Porsche had designed it with that typical German devotion to intricate detail. It was lighter than the Jeep, it used less fuel, and its clever air-cooled engine completely eliminated the vulnerability of radiators to enemy fire. But it possessed one critical, damning weakness. It was rear-wheel drive only. In the soft, shifting sands of North Africa, in the treacherous mountains of Italy, in the deep, sucking mud of Russia, that single limitation proved to be utterly devastating. The Jeep, by contrast, could instantly power all four of its wheels whenever the need arose. The system was so profoundly simple that even an uneducated soldier could master its use in a matter of minutes. The mechanics continued their methodical inspection. The suspension utilized simple leaf springs, crude when compared to the Cubewagon's sophisticated torsion bars, but they were infinitely easier to repair in the unforgiving conditions of the field. The electrical system was basic, yet incredibly robust. The fuel system could run on almost any grade of gasoline you could find, without any need for modification. But most troubling of all was the deliberate distribution of its weight. The Jeep weighed approximately 2,450 pounds, compared to the Cubewagon's 1,540, a difference of 910 pounds. German engineers would have immediately condemned this excess weight as a critical flaw, something that reduced performance and needlessly increased fuel consumption. But these mechanics, their hands stained with grease and reality, recognized the method behind this apparent madness. That extra weight translated directly into unyielding durability. The frame was overbuilt, a skeleton designed to handle a level of punishment that would utterly destroy lighter vehicles. The Americans had made a conscious decision that raw reliability under constant abuse mattered far more than optimal efficiency. They had built a vehicle fully expecting it to be misused, to be overloaded, to be subjected to conditions that no engineer would ever approve of, and they had engineered it to survive anyway. This was not the American incompetence that the Wehrmacht training films had promised them. This was engineering focused on brutal reality rather than elegant theory. The unit brought the captured Jeep back to their forward position. Over the next 3 days, the mechanics conducted an exhaustive series of tests. They drove it through the softest sand, places where their Cubewagens struggled and died. They loaded it far beyond its rated capacity. They subjected it to a level of abuse that would have crippled most of their own vehicles. The Jeep simply absorbed everything they threw at it. In soft terrain, where rear-wheel drive vehicles required careful, delicate driving and often became hopelessly stuck, the Jeep simply powered its way through. The low-range gearing allowed it to crawl over obstacles at a walking speed, a feat the Cubewagon's gearing couldn't hope to match, despite its clever reduction hubs. And so the word began to spread, a quiet murmur that rippled through the ranks of the Afrika Korps. The Americans had a vehicle that outperformed the Wehrmacht's equivalent in almost every single meaningful way. Officers and mechanics from other units came to examine it, to touch it, to understand. Their reactions always followed a predictable, 3-act pattern. First came the initial skepticism, then a slow, grudging respect, and finally, a quiet dismay as the full implications of what they were seeing became chillingly clear. One supply officer, a man who had worked in the great German automotive plants before the war, spent an entire afternoon studying the vehicle in silence. His final assessment was blunt and devoid of emotion. This represents a fundamental difference in approach. We build vehicles to achieve engineering perfection. The Americans build them to be manufactured. In a total war, that matters more. He explained to the assembled officers and NCOs precisely what that difference meant in real terms. "Look at this engine block," he said. "It's cast, not machined to fine tolerances. The Americans sacrifice a tiny amount of performance for massive gains in production speed. They can train a semi-skilled worker to assemble one of these engines in a fraction of the time it takes us to build a German engine. Now, multiply that efficiency across every single component." He then pointed to the stamped metal body panels. "These panels are crude compared to our vehicles, but they can be produced by the thousands in factories that, just a few years ago, were making household appliances. The Americans have mobilized their entire economy. Every refrigerator factory, every washing machine plant, every commercial vehicle manufacturer, all of it has been converted to military production. We cannot match this capacity." The officers fell silent. He had articulated the very thing that many of them had begun to suspect in their hearts. Germany's philosophy, so focused on quality and precision, made perfect sense in peacetime. But in the crucible of total war, the American approach of delivering adequate products, delivered with breathtaking speed, was proving to be devastatingly effective. One mechanic spent that evening writing a detailed technical report. He documented every single aspect of the Jeep's design, carefully noting both its strengths and its weaknesses. The report made its way up the chain of command, one of thousands of such documents being produced by German technical intelligence services across every front. Similar reports were flooding into Wehrmacht headquarters from every theater of the war. German mechanics and engineers were encountering American vehicles and equipment with increasing frequency, and their assessments were uniformly troubling. The Americans were outproducing Germany by ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. In late 1942, Wehrmacht intelligence commissioned a comprehensive study of Allied vehicle production. The results confirmed their absolute worst fears. American factories were producing military vehicles at a rate of thousands per day. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was completing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at its peak production. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than Germany's U-boats could sink them. The statistics revealed a sobering, undeniable truth. America's 1942 military vehicle production exceeded the total combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And that production was still ramping up. The captured Jeep became something of a celebrity within its unit. Soldiers competed for the chance to drive it. Officers used it for forward reconnaissance missions, trusting its rugged reliability more than their own vehicles. When parts eventually wore out, replacement components were scavenged from other captured Jeeps with a disconcerting, almost magical ease. Everything was interchangeable. By early 1943, the Afrika Korps had captured dozens of Jeeps. Wehrmacht mechanics formed informal networks, sharing maintenance knowledge and hoarded parts. A black market even emerged for captured American vehicles and equipment. A working Jeep could command prices that far exceeded its theoretical value because everyone, from the lowest private to the highest officer, recognized its clear superiority for the brutal realities of desert warfare. Then came May 13, 1943, the day the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war. Their war was over, but their education in the sheer scale of American manufacturing capacity was just beginning. The contrast between German and American capabilities became impossible to ignore during their long journey into captivity. American trucks transported prisoners in quantities that would have required endless columns of horse-drawn wagons in the Wehrmacht. American Liberty ships, typically built in just 5 to 6 weeks at peak production in 1943 compared to the 8 months they initially took, carried thousands of them across the vast Atlantic. Every single aspect of the logistical operation demonstrated an organizational capacity that dwarfed anything Germany had ever achieved. At the prisoner processing center in Oran, Algeria, captured German mechanics watched in silent awe as American motor pool sergeants serviced an entire fleet of vehicles with a casual, almost lazy efficiency that would have been utterly impossible in the Wehrmacht. The motor pool contained dozens upon dozens of jeeps, trucks, and command cars. Young American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, performed complex maintenance with a speed and confidence that was baffling. Tools were abundant, and always readily available. Parts were delivered without the endless requisition delays that plagued the German army. Every vehicle used the same basic components, allowing mechanics to service any vehicle in the fleet without needing specialized, model-specific knowledge. One American sergeant, who spoke a passable German, noticed a captured mechanic watching him intently. "You a mechanic?" he asked. "I was," the German replied. "Afrika Korps, vehicle maintenance." The sergeant grinned. "Well, no war for you now. But I bet you got questions. Come on, I'll show you around. Not like you can steal anything anymore." What followed was an educational afternoon that would forever change the German mechanic's perspective. The sergeant walked him through the entire motor pool, explaining the core tenets of American maintenance philosophy with an unguarded, almost shocking honesty. "See, the thing is," he said, "we design everything so any farm boy can fix it. Most of our guys never even saw a vehicle engine before basic training, so we make it simple. Color-coded wires, standard bolts, everything labeled. We got manuals written for a 6th grade reading level. The whole idea is that if something breaks, anyone can fix it without having to call in a specialist. The captured mechanic examined a disassembled Jeep engine. Every single component was clearly marked. The maintenance manual contained detailed illustrations and simple step-by-step instructions that could be followed by someone with only the most minimal mechanical knowledge. "How many of these do you produce?" he asked. The sergeant just shrugged. "Hell, I don't know the exact numbers, but thousands every week, I'd guess. They keep coming off the production lines faster than we can even ship them out. We got so many Jeeps that if one breaks down, we usually just grab another one instead of fixing it immediately." Thousands every week. The number seemed impossible, a fantasy, yet the evidence was all around him. This single motor pool contained more vehicles than entire German divisions had possessed, and this was just one small American unit at a forward supply base. The sergeant continued his tour. He showed him Dodge trucks capable of hauling loads that would require 2 German vehicles. He pointed out half-track personnel carriers, produced in such vast quantities that they made their German equivalents seem like handcrafted rarities. He gestured to tank transporters that could move heavy armor without wearing out their tracks. "Thing is," the sergeant explained, "we learned from the last war. We build everything with common components. A bolt from a Jeep fits a truck, which fits a half-track. Same thing with electrical parts, hydraulic systems, everything. It makes logistics simple. Instead of needing 1,000 different parts, we need maybe a couple hundred, and we produce them by the millions." This was the secret, the core concept that German manufacturing had never fully grasped. Component commonality wasn't just about production efficiency. It was about creating a complete logistical ecosystem where any part could be used anywhere, any mechanic could service any vehicle, and the entire system constantly reinforced itself. The long journey from North Africa to the American prison camps continued this profound education. At every single stop, the prisoners witnessed American production capacity operating at a scale that simply defied their German preconceptions. The port at Norfolk, Virginia, processed thousands of tons of supplies daily with a seamless mechanical efficiency. Giant cranes loaded and unloaded cargo at speeds that would have required entire armies of workers back in Hamburg. Trains carried the prisoners across the vast American continent in passenger coaches that would have been considered a luxury in Germany. And everywhere, there were vehicles. Cars filled massive parking lots outside factories. Trucks lined the highways in convoys that stretched for miles, disappearing over the horizon. Military vehicles sat in depot yards by the thousands, awaiting shipment to the combat zones. At Camp Hearn, Texas, skilled German mechanics volunteered for the motor pool. The American camp commanders welcomed their expertise, because the war effort demanded every single available worker. For the next 2 years, these German mechanics worked side by side with American soldiers, maintaining the very vehicles that kept the camp running. The American mechanics approached vehicle maintenance with a direct, unflinching practicality. They weren't engineers striving for some abstract perfection. They were problem solvers, focused on one thing and one thing only, keeping the equipment operational. When something broke, they fixed it quickly, using whatever was available. When parts weren't available, they improvised. When a vehicle proved to be unrepairable, they simply cannibalized it for components and requested a replacement, which would arrive within days, not weeks. The captured mechanics observed these American techniques closely. German mechanics were trained to maintain vehicles to precise factory specifications, a process that required specialized tools and proper, time-consuming procedures. American mechanics, in contrast, were trained to keep things running by any means necessary. In peacetime conditions, the German methods undoubtedly produced better results. But in the chaos of wartime, the American methods proved to be vastly more effective. The motor pool at Camp Hearn processed hundreds of vehicles every month. Jeeps would come in for routine maintenance, receive their service in a matter of hours rather than days, and be returned to service immediately. This incredible efficiency came from 2 things: an abundance of parts and the magic of component interchangeability. When a part needed replacement, the parts room had dozens of them in stock. When a tool was required, the tool room provided it immediately. When a vehicle was beyond repair, another one simply took its place. One of the German mechanics befriended an American soldier who had worked for Ford before the war. The American proved to be incredibly knowledgeable about the automotive sector. "Before the war," he said, "I worked on the assembly line at Willow Run. That's Ford's bomber plant outside Detroit, biggest factory in the world. We're building B-24 Liberators. Started production in '42. And by the time I got drafted last year, we were completing one bomber every hour. Every single hour, a complete 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off that line." The arithmetic was staggering, almost incomprehensible. 24 bombers per day. Over 700 per month. "How is such production even possible?" the German asked. "Mass production principles," the American explained. Mr. Ford figured out how to break down complex manufacturing into simple, repeatable steps. You don't need skilled craftsmen if every worker just does one simple task, over and over again. You can take a kid fresh off the farm, train him in a week to install one type of bolt in one specific location. You do that with 1,000 workers, and you get massive output. This was the fundamental difference. German production relied on highly skilled craftsmen building quality products in moderate quantities. American production relied on semi-skilled workers building adequate products in massive quantities. The American continued. "Same thing with the Jeeps. Willis Overland makes them. So does Ford. Both plants use the exact same, identical specifications. Apart from a Willis Jeep fits a Ford Jeep perfectly. They're completely interchangeable. That means if one plant gets bombed or has problems, the other one just keeps producing. And maintenance is simple, because every mechanic learns one vehicle, not dozens of different variants." The German mechanic thought about the Wehrmacht's own vehicle inventory. Dozens of different truck types from dozens of different manufacturers, each with its own unique parts and specific maintenance requirements. Kübelwagens from Volkswagen. Command cars from various sources. Captured vehicles from all across Europe, each requiring its own dedicated supply of spare parts and a unique knowledge base. German logistics were a nightmare of incompatible systems. American logistics, in contrast, were streamlined through an enforced uniformity. "The real genius," the American added, "is that we designed for manufacturability right from the start. When they put out the requirements for the Jeep back in '40, they gave companies just 75 days to produce a working prototype. American Bantam did it in 49 days. Then Willis and Ford refined the design for mass production. Everything had to be simple to manufacture, simple to maintain, and simple to repair." The captured mechanics had examined enough Jeeps by now to recognize this undeniable truth. The vehicle wasn't elegant. German engineers would have undoubtedly designed something far more sophisticated. But sophistication impeded mass production, and mass production was winning the war. By the summer of 1944, the prisoners had heard rumors of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. When the news finally arrived of the landing success, many of them felt no surprise at all. They knew the Allies had the manufacturing capacity to build an invasion fleet that would have taken Germany years to assemble. News filtered into the camps through American newspapers and radio broadcasts. They read accounts of the Normandy beaches, where Allied forces had landed with thousands of vehicles in the first wave alone. Jeeps, trucks, tanks, amphibious vehicles, all of them carried across the English Channel in purpose-built landing craft, which were themselves manufactured by the thousands. The sheer scale of the operation defied comprehension. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. Within a few short weeks, millions of Allied soldiers would be fighting in Europe, all of them supplied by a production base that created equipment faster than the Wehrmacht could possibly destroy it. The German prisoners reflected on their pre-war confidence in victory. That confidence had been based on a series of assumptions about German technological superiority. Those assumptions had proven to be tragically incomplete. Germany did have superior engineering in many areas. German tanks were more heavily armored and better armed than most of their American equivalents. German aircraft were often more sophisticated. German small arms were excellent. But none of that mattered when America could produce 5 tanks for every one that Germany built, 10 trucks for every German truck, 100 jeeps for every Cuba wagon. In the motor pool one afternoon, the prisoners watched as American soldiers loaded jeeps onto transport trucks for shipment to the port. A young private drove each jeep up the loading ramps with a casual, almost bored confidence. Dozens of vehicles were loaded in less than an hour, all of them bound for Europe to replace losses and supply new units. One German mechanic had a sudden, chilling realization. This single loading operation, at one camp in Texas, represented more vehicles than his entire division had possessed back in North Africa. And this same scene was being repeated at camps and depots all across America, every single day. The mathematics became inescapable. Germany had mobilized its entire economy for total war, stripping civilian production down to the bone to support its military manufacturing. Yet, German military vehicle production in 1943 totaled less than 100,000 units of all types. America, while still maintaining a thriving civilian economy, produced over 2 million military vehicles in the same year. The disparity wasn't just quantitative. It was qualitative. American vehicles were designed for the brutal realities of wartime: ease of maintenance, interchangeable parts, simple operation, and rugged, unflinching reliability. German vehicles were engineered to specifications that made perfect sense in peacetime, but proved to be hopelessly impractical in sustained, grinding combat. In November 1944, news reached the camp of a massive German offensive in the Ardennes, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last, desperate gamble in the West. The offensive relied heavily on capturing American fuel supplies, because Germany no longer had sufficient fuel of its own to sustain major armored operations. More troubling still were the reports of Operation Greif, Otto Skorzeny's commando operation that used captured American equipment. German soldiers had been equipped with captured jeeps, American uniforms, and fake identification, and were tasked with infiltrating Allied lines to cause confusion and capture vital bridges. If even Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, the man who had rescued Mussolini, was reduced to depending on captured American vehicles because Germany's own vehicles were insufficient, that revealed everything about the Wehrmacht's dire materials situation. The operation failed. American military police quickly identified the German infiltrators through careful questioning about American culture and procedures. The Ardennes offensive itself ground to a halt, not primarily from American resistance, though that was certainly fierce, but because the German forces simply ran out of fuel. Panzer divisions abandoned their tanks when the fuel trucks failed to arrive. Infantry divisions resorted to horse-drawn transport because their motorized logistics had completely collapsed. By January 1945, the German attack had been contained and decisively reversed. The spring of 1945 brought with it the news of Germany's final collapse. The Red Army was closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany from the west. In the camp motor pool, the German mechanics continued their work, maintaining vehicles for the very army that had defeated their homeland. They felt no satisfaction in their work, but they felt no shame either. They understood. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because it had challenged powers whose production capacity it could never hope to match. One afternoon in April, an American soldier approached them with news. Germany surrendered. War's over in Europe. The mechanics just nodded. They had been expecting this for months. What happens to us now? One asked. You'll go home eventually. Probably not immediately. Lots of logistics to work out. But you'll go home. One mechanic considered this. Home. Home to a Germany that had been bombed into rubble, a nation occupied by foreign armies, its cities destroyed by the very same manufacturing might that had produced the Jeep he had first examined all those years ago in the desert. The American asked. You're a smart guy. Did you really think Germany could win? The mechanic thought carefully about his answer before he spoke. Before the war, yes. We believed that German quality would overcome American quantity. We had seen American products before the war, and many of them were inferior to their German equivalents. We assumed your military equipment would be the same. But it wasn't, the American said. No. When we examined that first Jeep back in '42, we realized we had made a fundamental error. We had confused peacetime quality with wartime effectiveness. Your Jeep wasn't better engineered than our Cubawagon in absolute terms. It was better designed for mass production and for field conditions. In a total war, that proved to be decisive. The American nodded slowly. Yeah. We build adequate products, quickly and in huge quantities. Exactly. They stood there in silence for a moment, two mechanics from opposing sides of a world war, united by a shared, unspoken understanding of what had actually determined its outcome. The repatriation process began in late 1945. The German prisoners boarded ships for the long journey home. One mechanic arrived in Bremerhaven in January 1946, processing through a series of Allied control stations before finally being released. The city was in ruins. Rubble stretched in every direction, as far as the eye could see. But amid the utter destruction, he noticed something. American vehicles were everywhere. Jeeps were carrying Allied officers through the shattered streets. Trucks were delivering relief supplies. Motor pools had been set up, where German civilians now worked alongside Allied soldiers. He approached one such motor pool, introducing himself to the American captain in command. His English, learned during his long years of captivity, was serviceable. Sir, I am a former Oberfeldwebel of the Afrika Korps, recently repatriated from Camp Hearn, Texas. I am a trained vehicle mechanic with experience maintaining American equipment. Are you hiring civilian workers? The captain examined his identification papers. Says here you worked in our motor pool in Texas. Is that right? Yes, sir. For 2 years. The captain made a note. We need mechanics desperately. Most German mechanics either died in the war or are still in POW camps. You can start tomorrow. Pay is an occupation script, redeemable for rations and necessities. And so, the former Afrika Korps mechanic found himself employed by the very army he had once fought against, maintaining the same vehicles he had once examined as pieces of enemy equipment. The Allies needed mechanics. He needed work. The war was over. Life continued. Over the following months, he witnessed the very beginning of Germany's reconstruction. American aid poured in, distributed with the same logistical efficiency that had won the war. Food, medicine, construction materials, all of it arrived in American trucks, coordinated by American planners who approached the task of rebuilding Germany systematically. He worked in the motor pool, training young Germans in American maintenance techniques. Many of his students were former Wehrmacht soldiers just like himself, men who now needed civilian skills in a Germany that would no longer have a military. He taught them what he had observed, what he had learned. Simplicity over sophistication. Functionality over perfection. Results over theory. These were lessons learned from American vehicles, lessons that were directly applicable to the task of rebuilding German manufacturing. By 1947, he had been promoted to supervisor of the motor pool's German civilian staff. The American captain who commanded the facility treated him with respect, valuing his experience and his organizational skills. One evening, the captain invited him to share a drink in his office. I've been thinking about something, the captain said. You've worked with both German and American vehicles extensively. If you were designing a vehicle for the new Germany, what would it look like? He considered the question carefully. I would adapt the American approach for European conditions. Smaller than a Jeep, more fuel efficient, but maintaining the same core philosophy. Common parts, simple maintenance, designed for manufacturing rather than for engineering awards. Europe has narrow roads and limited fuel, but we need the reliability of American design thinking. The captain nodded. That's smart. Marshall Plan money is going to rebuild German manufacturing, and German engineers are already studying American methods. The future is American-style mass production, adapted for local conditions. This proved to be prophetic. In the decades that followed, West German manufacturing adopted this American production philosophy while still maintaining its traditional German attention to quality. The result was an economic renaissance that transformed Germany from a devastated nation into a global powerhouse. Companies like Volkswagen, which had produced the Kübelwagen during the war, evolved into global automotive giants by combining German engineering precision with American mass production techniques. The Volkswagen Beetle, which became one of history's best-selling automobiles, perfectly embodied this synthesis. It was simple, reliable, manufacturable in huge quantities, and affordable for average families. Former Wehrmacht mechanics who had worked in American prison camp motor pools returned to Germany with knowledge that proved to be invaluable. They understood component standardization. They had witnessed efficient parts distribution systems. They had seen firsthand how simplified maintenance procedures increased vehicle availability. They had observed how designing for manufacturability rather than for abstract perfection enabled mass production on an incredible scale. These insights, gained through years of maintaining American equipment, influenced German automotive design for decades to come. The German manufacturers that emerged from the ruins didn't try to recreate their pre-war approaches. Instead, they synthesized German precision with American production efficiency. By the early 1950s, this hybrid approach was producing astonishing results. Volkswagen's production ramped up from thousands of vehicles annually to hundreds of thousands. Mercedes-Benz adapted assembly line techniques while still maintaining their legendary quality standards. BMW restructured its manufacturing to emphasize component commonality across all its model lines. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s owed a great deal to these profound changes. West Germany became an export powerhouse, selling vehicles globally that combined reliability with affordability. The synthesis of German and American approaches had created products that neither nation's pre-war philosophy could have produced alone. U.S. Army historian Hugh M. Cole, who interviewed Wehrmacht generals after their surrender, documented their unique perspective. Cole reported that the German military leaders admired the Jeep more than anything else in the formidable American arsenal. Not the B-17 bombers, not the Sherman tanks, not the artillery, but the simple, humble Jeep, because it represented the manufacturing philosophy that had actually won the war. General George C. Marshall himself called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This wasn't hyperbole. The Jeep embodied principles that transformed not just military logistics, but the entire landscape of post-war global manufacturing, standardization, simplification, design for production, and an unwavering emphasis on reliability over sophistication. By November 1943, the U.S. Army had enough data on captured Kübelwagens to publish Technical Manual TM E9-803, a complete guide to operating and maintaining the German vehicles. The manual was published on June 6, 1944, D-Day, enabling American forces landing in France to utilize any Kübelwagen they happened to capture. The Wehrmacht never published an equivalent manual for the Jeep, despite capturing thousands of them. They didn't need to. The Jeep was so intuitive, so fundamentally simple, that any mechanic could figure it out. This single contrast illustrated the fundamental difference in design philosophy. The Kübelwagen required a detailed manual, translated into English, for American mechanics to understand its sophisticated systems. The Jeep required no manual at all for German mechanics to operate and maintain it effectively. The reunions began in the 1960s. Former members of the Afrika Korps who had been captured in Tunisia gathered to remember their fallen comrades. At one such gathering in 1967, an impromptu discussion arose about the vehicles of the war. One former mechanic offered his perspective. The Kübelwagen was better engineered in many respects. It was lighter, more fuel-efficient, excellent for desert conditions where its air-cooled engine gave it distinct advantages. But the Jeep was better designed for modern war. Four-wheel drive, simpler maintenance, common parts, and most importantly, it was producible in quantities we could never, ever match. An old officer who had once commanded a reconnaissance unit nodded in agreement. I remember capturing my first Jeep back in '41. We thought it was crude compared to our own vehicles. It took us months to realize that its simplicity was actually a form of elegant efficiency. By '43, Every unit wanted captured jeeps because they simply worked better under combat conditions. Another veteran added, "The worst moment for me was realizing that America was producing more jeeps in a single week than Germany produced Kübelwagens in an entire year. That's when I knew we would lose. Not from any particular battle, but from simple mathematics. They could replace their losses faster than we could possibly inflict them." This was the consensus that emerged from all such discussions. The German soldiers had a tremendous respect for the Kübelwagen as a vehicle. But they recognized that the Jeep, and what it represented about American production capacity, had been the decisive factor. Not through its combat effectiveness alone, though it was certainly effective, but through what it revealed about the vast, unbridgeable disparity in manufacturing capability between the combatants. The Wehrmacht's logistical situation had been dire throughout the entire war. By 1943, approximately 80% of German divisions still relied on horse-drawn transport. The German army entered World War II with 514,000 horses and would eventually employ 2.75 million horses and mules during the war, with approximately 1.1 million horses in service at any given time. Over 2 million of these animals died during the conflict. In stark contrast, American divisions were completely motorized. Every single American unit relied on trucks, not horses, for its logistics. This created operational advantages that Wehrmacht commanders could only envy. American supply columns could move hundreds of kilometers in a single day. German supply columns, limited by the walking speed of horses, averaged perhaps 30 kilometers daily, and only in good conditions. When Wehrmacht generals examined the reasons for their defeat, they consistently pointed to this material disparity rather than to tactical or strategic failures. German soldiers had fought with incredible skill and courage. German officers had made reasonable tactical decisions. But German industry simply couldn't produce enough equipment to sustain operations against enemies with such overwhelming material superiority. The Jeep became the symbol of this disparity, because every German soldier who encountered one instantly understood what it represented. Here was a vehicle so abundant that the Americans treated it as disposable, so reliable that it required only minimal maintenance, so simple that any soldier could operate and repair it, and so effective that German units preferentially used captured jeeps over their own vehicles whenever possible. In 1976, the United States Army began replacing the Jeep with the WWII. The Jeep had served for 35 years, an extraordinary lifespan for any military vehicle. Many remained in service with reserve units and Allied militaries for decades more. That same year, Volkswagen celebrated the 1 millionth VW Golf produced. The Golf, like the Beetle before it, embodied the lessons learned from both German and American approaches, precision engineering combined with mass production efficiency, the very synthesis that had rebuilt Germany. By the 1980s, West Germany had become one of the world's leading economies. German automotive companies exported millions of vehicles annually. German manufacturing was once again synonymous with quality and reliability, but that quality was now paired with efficient production methods that owed a great deal to American influence. The final Africa Corps reunion took place in 1998. Fewer than 24 veterans attended, all of them in their 70s or 80s, the last survivors of a conflict that had ended more than half a century earlier. During the reunion, someone mentioned that a local museum had acquired a restored Willys MB Jeep. Most of them wanted to visit. They stood around the vehicle, these elderly men who had once been young soldiers in Africa, examining it with the practiced eyes of mechanics and warriors who had come to deeply respect it. One veteran reached out to touch the hood, his arthritic fingers tracing the familiar, simple lines. "I captured one of these in '42, he said softly. "Used it for 3 months before I got wounded at El Alamein. Best vehicle I ever drove. Better than anything we had." Another nodded slowly. "I examined one in Tunisia, just before we surrendered. I couldn't believe how simple the design was. I realized then that we had been approaching vehicle design all wrong. Too complicated. Too difficult to produce and maintain. They made over 600,000 of them." A third veteran added, "We made 50,000 Kübelwagens. That ratio told you everything. They stood in silence for a long moment. The jeep sat before them, a museum piece now, its war long over. But for these veterans, it represented something more than just a historical artifact. It was a symbol of the production capacity that had defeated them, the functional engineering that had proven so brutally effective, the sheer abundance that had overwhelmed their scarcity. "We never had vehicles like this," one of them finally said. "Not in these numbers, not with this reliability, not designed with the same philosophy. We built for perfection. They built for production." This was the lesson that Wehrmacht mechanics had absorbed while examining captured jeeps in the deserts of North Africa, in the mountains of Italy, in the fields of France. It was a lesson that shaped post-war Germany and influenced global development for generations. The jeep had been more than just a vehicle. It had been an education. The Wehrmacht mechanics, humbled by their defeat, had proven to be excellent students. They studied not just how to maintain American equipment, but why that equipment had been designed as it was, and what those design choices revealed about the manufacturing philosophy that had won the war. That knowledge, painful in its acquisition, became the foundation for Germany's reconstruction and its eventual prosperity. The defeat taught them humility. The American equipment taught them functional engineering. The combination produced a new German philosophy that served the nation far better than its pre-war hubris ever could. The story of the Wehrmacht mechanics and the jeep is a story of learning through defeat. Pride had told them that German engineering was superior, that quality would always triumph over quantity, that sophistication would overcome simplicity. Reality taught them otherwise. American vehicles were not better engineered than their German equivalents in most technical specifications, but they were better designed for the realities of modern warfare, producible in massive quantities, maintainable by minimally trained personnel, built with common interchangeable parts, and reliable under constant abuse. This functionality, multiplied by American manufacturing capacity, created an overwhelming material superiority that no amount of German skill or courage could ever overcome. The Wehrmacht had excellent soldiers, capable officers, and sophisticated equipment. But it lacked the fundamental foundation necessary to sustain a total war against enemies who could produce equipment faster than Germany could possibly destroy it. The mechanics who maintained both German and American vehicles understood this through direct, hands-on experience. They had seen both systems operate. They had worked with vehicles designed according to two completely different philosophies. They knew which approach worked better under the relentless pressure of combat conditions. That knowledge informed their work in rebuilding Germany. When they trained young mechanics, they emphasized the lessons learned the hard way. When they consulted on industrial processes, they advocated for standardization and simplification. When they designed new products, they prioritized manufacturability and reliability above all else. The engineers who rebuilt the German automotive and machinery sectors had studied captured American equipment, worked in prison camp motor pools, and observed American manufacturing methods firsthand. They created a hybrid, German precision combined with American production efficiency. That hybrid proved to be extraordinarily successful. By the 1970s, West Germany had become a leading exporter of manufactured goods. This economic success validated the lessons learned from defeat. Germany had abandoned the hubris that had contributed to its catastrophe and had adopted a more effective approach, informed by a careful study of the victor's methods. The jeep played a meaningful role in that transformation through the power of direct experience. Every Wehrmacht mechanic who maintained a captured jeep absorbed invaluable insights about American philosophy. Every officer who rode in a captured jeep recognized its clear advantages. Every soldier who witnessed the sheer, unending abundance of Allied vehicles understood what their own propaganda had tried so desperately to conceal. These experiences, shared by hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and prisoners, created a widespread understanding that Germany's defeat was not primarily military, but material. This understanding shaped the nation's entire attitude toward reconstruction. German leaders and engineers looked to adapt American methods rather than trying to restore pre-war practices that had proven so inadequate. They embraced mass manufacturing rather than emphasizing small-scale craft production. They designed for manufacturability, and reliability rather than for a theoretical perfection, regardless of the production difficulty. The Wehrmacht mechanics who first encountered those jeeps in the North African deserts could not possibly have imagined the long-term influence of that single encounter. They were simply trying to understand an enemy vehicle, to assess its capabilities, to determine whether it could be used by their own forces. In doing so, they discovered profound truths about manufacturing capacity and engineering philosophy that would shape the rest of their lives and influence their nation's reconstruction for decades to come. The last of those mechanics have long since passed away. Their direct testimony is lost to time, but the lessons they learned remain embedded in industrial practices worldwide. Every vehicle designed today for ease of manufacture owes something to the philosophy that the Jeep embodied. Every standardized part reflects the American influence on global standards. Every emphasis on reliability echoes the lessons learned in those dusty motor pools where Wehrmacht mechanics maintained captured American equipment. This is the Jeep's true legacy. It was a teacher of principles that transformed manufacturing. It taught that assumptions about superiority must always be examined. It taught that functional effectiveness matters far more than sophisticated design. It taught that designing for manufacture and maintenance serves better than designing for perfection. Those lessons helped transform Germany from a defeated enemy into a prosperous ally. The mechanics who admitted they had never had vehicles like the Jeep became the architects of their nation's renewal. Their humility, born from defeat and educated by observation, served Germany far better than the pride that had preceded its catastrophe. In November 1942, while examining a captured Jeep in the vast North African desert, a handful of Wehrmacht mechanics began a journey of discovery that would ultimately influence a generation. The mechanics who drove those captured Jeeps admitted they had never had vehicles like it. That single admission marked the beginning of a wisdom that would go on to rebuild the nation.